In 1902, 12 men volunteered to eat poison every single day. What they discovered changed what billions of people eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner with a bottle of ketchup. A government chemist stands at the head of a long dining table in Washington, D.C., watching 12 young men lift their forks. The food in front of them looks completely ordinary. Roast meat, bread, a small dish of ketchup on the side. What none of the diners fully understand is that their meal has been deliberately laced with the same chemical preservatives sitting inside grocery store condiments all across the country. Within hours, cramps set in. Within days, some of them can barely eat at all. This isn't an accident, and it isn't a crime scene. It's 1902, and these men signed up for this on purpose. They call themselves the Poison Squad, and the man running the experiment, chemist Harvey Wiley, is trying to answer a question the entire country has been too afraid to ask out loud. What is actually inside America's food? The results of this experiment will end up rewriting federal law. But buried inside that story is something stranger. A condiment so ordinary, so familiar, that almost nobody eating it that year had any idea it carried a secret history stretching back nearly 2,000 years, to a place that had nothing to do with tomatoes at all. To understand how a bottle of ketchup ended up on a government poisoning test, you have to go back to the very beginning. And the beginning isn't in America. It isn't even in Europe. It starts on the coast of southern China, where fishing villages faced a problem older than written history itself. Too much fish, and no way to keep it from rotting. Their solution was clever. Pack the fish in salt, seal it in clay, and let it slowly break down over weeks. What came out the other side was a thick, dark, intensely savory liquid, something locals in the Hokkien-speaking regions called ketchup. No sugar, no tomatoes, just salt, fish, and thyme. That's the twist almost nobody sees coming. The word ketchup is Chinese in origin, and for over 1,000 years, it meant something closer to fermented fish sauce than anything resembling what's in your fridge right now. For centuries, that's exactly what it stayed. A regional preservation technique, quietly feeding coastal communities across Asia. But sauces this good rarely stay contained, and by the 1600s, European trading ships pushing into Southeast Asia were about to change everything. British and Dutch sailors kept encountering local variations of this fermented sauce in port after port, and they couldn't get enough of it. The problem was, they had no idea how to actually make it. Fermentation takes weeks, specific climates, specific ingredients, none of which existed back home in England. So instead of bringing the real recipe back, they brought back a memory of the flavor, and English cooks started guessing. What followed was almost chaotic. 18th century English kitchens produced dozens of competing ketchups made from whatever was on hand. Walnuts, oysters, anchovies, even mushrooms. Mushroom ketchup in particular became a genuine staple on English dinner tables, a thin, dark, savory liquid poured over meat, nothing like a dipping sauce for fries. If history had frozen right there, we'd all be squeezing fermented mushroom liquid onto our burgers today. So how did tomatoes finally enter a story that had survived over 1,000 years without them? The answer involves a fruit that, for generations, people were terrified to eat. When tomatoes arrived in Europe from the Americas in the 1500s, botanists immediately noticed something unsettling. The plant belonged to the nightshade family, the same family as deadly nightshade, a plant capable of killing an adult within hours. That resemblance was enough to brand the tomato as dangerous across much of Europe.
Do not touch that, it is poison.
Wealthy households grew them purely as garden ornaments, admiring the color from a distance, never once considering a bite. Here's where the real history gets stranger than the legend. Popular retellings often claim tomatoes themselves were mildly toxic, which simply isn't true. The actual explanation involves the plates people were eating off of. Wealthy Europeans commonly used pewter dinnerware containing high amounts of lead, and tomatoes are highly acidic. That acid pulled lead directly out of the metal and into the food sitting on top of it. People weren't being poisoned by tomatoes at all. They were being poisoned by their own dinnerware, and it would take generations before anyone figured that out. While the aristocracy stayed terrified, Poorer communities in southern Italy had already been quietly eating tomatoes for decades, using simple clay pots instead of lead-laced plates, discovering that this fruit, cooked down slowly with olive oil and garlic, produced something extraordinary. That regional confidence eventually crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and by the early 1800s, America's fear of the tomato was finally starting to fade too. In 1812, a Philadelphia scientist named James Mees published what historians now consider the earliest known recipe for tomato-based ketchup in America. It bore almost no resemblance to the thick, sweet sauce we know today. Thinner, spicier, no added sugar. But for the first time, two completely separate food histories had finally collided. An ancient Asian fermentation technique had met an American fruit people had only recently stopped fearing. You'd expect that to be a happy turning point. It wasn't. It was actually the start of ketchup's most dangerous chapter, and the one that leads directly back to that dining table in 1902. As demand for bottled tomato ketchup exploded through the late 1800s, homemade batches spoiled quickly, and manufacturers scrambled for ways to extend shelf life. Some of those methods were reckless almost beyond belief. Borax, formaldehyde, and heavy chemical preservatives found their way into bottles sold in ordinary grocery stores, alongside coal tar dyes used to disguise unripe, pale tomatoes as deep, appetizing red. Families had no real way of knowing what they were actually feeding their children. This is precisely the crisis that pulled Harvey Wiley and his 12 volunteers into that Washington dining room. Somebody had to find out, definitively, what these preservatives were doing to the human body, and nobody was willing to simply take the food industry's word for it. One man saw this national panic not as a disaster, but as an opening. Henry Heinz had already lost everything once, watching an earlier business built around horseradish collapse into bankruptcy. Instead of walking away from food production, he came back in 1876 with something bold. A tomato ketchup made purely from ripe tomatoes, real vinegar, and enough natural sugar to preserve it without a single artificial additive. He bottled it in clear glass, deliberately, so customers could actually see what they were buying. A radical move at a time when most bottles were designed to hide their contents, not reveal them. The gamble paid off in a way Heinz probably couldn't have predicted. As Wiley's Poison Squad findings helped push Congress toward passing the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, Heinz became one of the loudest industry voices supporting stricter regulation, fully confident his product had nothing to hide. While competitors scrambled to reformulate or quietly went out of business, Heinz's ketchup empire kept expanding, eventually producing millions of bottles a year. From there, ketchup's story becomes inseparable from the rise of American food culture itself. As hamburgers, hot dogs, and roadside diners spread across the 20th century, ketchup rode along beside them, becoming the default companion for anything fried, grilled, or served in a bun. But its reach didn't stop at American borders. Thousands of miles away in Australia, tomato sauce, as it's almost universally called there, worked its way into rituals of its own. The classic Australian sausage sizzle, a fundraising tradition found outside hardware stores and polling places on election day, simply doesn't exist without a thick stripe of it across a slice of white bread. Meat pies, one of the country's defining comfort foods, sparked their own lasting debate over whether the sauce belongs on top or injected inside. A sauce that began as fermented fish on the coast of China had, through centuries of accident and reinvention, become a genuine marker of identity on two different continents. And somewhere in the middle of all that history sits the real answer to the question the opening scene never fully explained. The preservative Harvey Wiley tested that day in 1902 was sodium benzoate, a chemical additive some manufacturers had started using in cheaper ketchup brands to extend shelf life without doing the honest work Heinz had already committed to. The Poison Squad's findings didn't just embarrass an industry. They helped prove that trust, not chemistry tricks, was what would actually determine which bottle of ketchup survived the century. So the next time that bottle lands on your table, at a backyard barbecue, a diner booth, or a sausage sizzle outside a polling place, it's worth remembering what's really inside it. Not just tomatoes and vinegar, but the ghost of a 2,000-year journey. A fermentation technique from ancient China, a feared fruit from South America, a chemistry mistake involving lead-laced dinnerware, and 12 brave men who ate deliberately poisoned meals so the rest of the country could finally trust what was sitting on their own dinner table.